Marriage Stone by Josephine Darcy. Chapter 53, Polite Affections. When Harry headed down to the Great Hall for dinner the following evening, the last thing he expected was to come around a corner and find his two best friends locked in a heated embrace. They had obviously been waiting for him. The corridor was largely unused, save by Severus and Harry on their way to and from the Great Hall. But apparently they'd found something to do other than talk during the wait. Harry stared at them in open-mouthed shock. Illuminated by the torchlight, he could see Hermione leaning against the stone wall of the corridor. Ron had his hands placed against the wall on either side of her head, his body leaning into hers as he kissed her deeply. At some point, one of his hands moved to her hair, fingers tangling in the brown locks as he tilted her face upward for better access, his mouth moving hungrily against hers. From the looks of things, it was obvious that Hermione found this unexpectedly aggressive behavior quite pleasing. A soft moan escaped her throat as she returned his kiss. It was the second time in as many days that Harry had watched two people kissing. And just like with Charlie and Draco, Harry felt a flush of embarrassment sweep over him. He knew, of course, that Ron was crazy about Hermione and that those feelings were more than returned. Certainly, he'd watched the two of them dancing around one another long enough to expect such a thing. But the sight still caught him off guard. He couldn't help but wonder how many times the two of them had kissed like this. Hermione had implied not long ago that their relationship had not progressed this far. But then again, they were 16, and 16-year-olds were not known for their restraint. Perhaps their own Valentine's Day exchange had sparked some change between them. As he watched, Harry felt something awake inside him. Something more than just embarrassment. What would it be like, he wondered, to be kissed like that? For one moment, he tried to imagine himself in the same situation, and then he stumbled upon a roadblock. Which position would he take? Ron's or Hermione's? If someone were to kiss him, Severus, perhaps, he wondered? He was married to Severus, and after the numerous sword lessons with a great deal of physical contact, he was beginning to think he might not be entirely opposed to the idea. Would he be the one pressed up against the wall like Hermione was, or would he be the aggressor? Images from the dreams he'd been having returned to him, stirring his body. The man in those dreams had been strong and powerful, manipulating his body with ease and skill. He'd felt overwhelmed in those dreams, his senses overpowered by taste and touch and the warmth of another body moving against his. Severus was strong, he thought, his body hard with well-earned muscles. And there was no passivity in his soul. He could not, by any stretch of the imagination, picture Severus in Hermione's position. His heart fluttered in shock as he wondered what it would be like to have Severus press against him like that, or like the man in his dream. Heat rushed through him, his face growing hot. Merlin, what was wrong with him? He wasn't what, he asked himself. Wasn't gay? He'd pretty much come to the conclusion that he probably was. He was certainly attracted to men. To Severus, at least. Though how weird was that? His potions master, the bane of his existence. But there wasn't anyone in the world who had eyes as intense as Severus. And his voice. Harry shivered. His voice could melt steel. Like he even liked the scent of the man. At least his scent when he wasn't covered in strange potion fumes. But what about Severus himself? Was he even gay? For all he knew, Severus liked tall blonde women instead of geeky-looking Gryffindors. A thought occurred to him, and Harry felt himself stiffening in indignation. What if Severus had a girlfriend? Or a boyfriend, for that matter? For all he knew, the man might have been in a long-term relationship with someone for years now. It's not like they had ever talked about it. He spent so much time fretting over the fact that he had been forced to marry Severus. He had forgotten the fact that Severus had also been forced to marry him. Certainly no one had bothered asking Severus that night so many months ago if he was already involved with someone else. For all he knew, Severus could have a dozen lovers hidden away somewhere, and Harry would never know it. "Oh, Harry!" Hermione exclaimed in shock, drawing his attention away from the odd thoughts racing through his head. "Harry!" Ron exclaimed as well, his face red with embarrassment. Both of his friends looked like they'd been caught with their heads in the cookie jar, too embarrassed to even move away from one another. "Sorry!" Harry broke in quickly, equally embarrassed to have been caught staring at them. All three of them looked at one another for a moment, before they each broke into nervous giggles and grinned. "Let's go to dinner," Hermione suggested, and almost right with the world once again. Eager to put the scene behind them, they raced down the corridor toward the great hall, entering the crowded hall with a sigh of relief. Ron and Hermione usually sat across from one another at dinner, but in light of the situation, Harry wasn't surprised that they chose to sit next to each other instead. Harry just grinned sheepishly at the both of them as he took his own seat across from the couple. To his consternation, however, Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil sat on either side of him. They had several other girls with them, 7th years and 5th years, including Ginny. All of them were engaged in a rather heated discussion about marriage. The various romances at Hogwarts had been the talk of the school yesterday on Valentine's Day. The marriage of Draco Malfoy had been the hottest topic amongst the girls, particularly last night in Gryffindor Tower, when Bill, Percy, and the twins had returned with Ron, Ginny, and Harry after the ceremony. Everyone had wanted to know if Charlie had gotten through with it. If Charlie Weasley had actually married the Malfoy heir. While the girls all agreed that Draco was handsome, his personality had put most of them off. They wanted to hear in minute detail precisely how he'd behaved with Charlie. It seemed today that the talk still had not died down, though now the girls were discussing the merits of an arranged marriage, and judging by the way Lavender and Parvati were draping themselves over Harry, they wanted his input on what he thought of the custom. He sighed in irritation. Why were girls so touchy? My parents want to arrange my marriage now, Lavender was complaining to everyone listening. They think it has become far more fashionable again. If it's good enough for Harry Potter, then it should be good enough for everyone. And they figured that obviously the Malfoys agree as well. Their parents used to be progressive. Now they want to be traditional. But Draco's marriage wasn't arranged, Hermione interrupted. Or rather, it was arranged by Draco and Charlie, and not by the parents. Doesn't look that way to hear Mr. Malfoy speak of it, Parvati replied. The paper suggested that Dumbledore had something to do with the arrangements. My parents are thinking about asking him to arrange my marriage as well. Well, I for one don't want an arranged marriage, Lavender stated. I can't even begin to imagine it. Lavender, Hermione warned, glancing at Harry apologetically. Harry suspected that the girl was not even aware of the fact that she was technically insulting him. Oh, bother! Lavender grumbled. She put her arm around Harry's shoulder and squeezed him briefly before patting him contritely on the leg. I'm sorry, Harry. I know your marriage was arranged, but still, I don't want to be stuck in some horrible marriage. I mean, what if my parents pick someone terrible? What are you left with for the rest of your life? Worst case scenario, you have to live with someone where the only emotion between you is cold disdain. Or maybe, if you're lucky, cool regard. The best you could ever possibly hope for is polite affection, and who wants to go through life like that, with no passion, no fire? I think I'd rather die. Parvati, on Harry's other side, grinned at him as she tugged on a lock of his hair teasingly. Which do you have, Harry? Cold disdain, cool regard, or polite affection? There was laughter up and down the table, and Harry flushed in discomfiture, glaring at all of them. Are those my only choices? He demanded. Apparently so, Ron remarked, equally as irritated by the topic of conversation. He glared at the girls. I suppose you think that's all my brother can hope for as well. He's married to a Malfoy, Lavender reminded him. They take the word cold to a new height. I don't know about that, Neville said thoughtfully from further down the table. It didn't seem all that cold to me when he was flinging daggers at the head table. Good point, Dean agreed with a nod of his head. And I'm pretty certain we can all rule out polite as well. More laughter followed that. For Professor Snape as well, Seamus added. There, you see, Hermione said to the two girls. You're going to have to broaden your definition of an arranged marriage. But Lavender was not about to be put off. You can't tell me you want your parents to arrange your marriage for you, can you? She asked. I mean, what would you do if they told you tomorrow that they've decided that you are going to marry Ernie Macmillan next week and there were absolutely nothing you could do about it? First off, my parents are muggles and don't believe in arranged marriages, Hermione reminded her. And second, I didn't say I liked the idea of arranged marriages. I'd just like to point out that a lot of people here don't have any choice in the matter, and you shouldn't go around disparaging the custom. Some arranged marriages work out just fine. People can be perfectly happy in arranged marriages. Perfectly happy, Lavender grumbled. Perfectly happy in their mediocre, passionless lives. Name one arranged marriage that turned into true love. My parents, Ron stated flatly. Everyone turned to look at him in shock. He just shrugged. They were engaged to be married when they were 10 years old. They fell in love while they were here at Hogwarts together. You can't tell me there's no passion in that love. My mom's pregnant again, for merlin's sake! There were squeals of shock from the girls who had somehow missed that little tidbit of news yesterday, and Lavender looked quite surprised. In a matter of seconds, the topic of conversation turned from marriages to babies, and Harry rolled his eyes as he stared across the table at Ron and Hermione. He much preferred when they sat in their normal seats with Dean, Seamus, and Neville around them. Harry found himself deep in thought as he made his way back down to his room that evening after dinner. There were too many ideas running through his head, distracting him. Mediocre, passionless lives. Is that really what they thought his life was doomed to become? Or perhaps he'd managed the polite affection. Was that all he could ever expect? He couldn't help but remember the passionate embrace between Charlie and Draco at the wedding yesterday. Or the kiss between Ron and Hermione earlier. And once again, he began to wonder if Severus had someone else in his life. It bothered him that he knew so little about that man's past, knew nothing at all about his private life, despite the fact that he'd been living with him for nearly a half a year now. The man was too intense, too powerful to live his life without some sense of passion in it. Any relationship he might be engaged in would certainly not be cold or emotionless. But what if it wasn't a relationship? A nagging voice in his head wondered. What if it was just sex? Severus wasn't a Gryffindor after all. Harry doubted he believed in the ideas of true love or fidelity. There was plenty of speculation amongst the students about the roles the various houses followed. Gryffindors had grand, high romances filled with epic passion, tragedy, and eternal love. Hufflepuffs preferred the quiet, subtle relationships that remained unchanged from one moment to the next, mellowing into friendship. Ravenclaws went for the logical choice, the compatible companion who could support a mutual future of quiet comfort. And Slytherins. Harry sighed at that. Slytherins were cold and calculating, moving from one seduction to the next, and leaving a trail of broken hearts behind them. He realized, of course, that the categorizations were ridiculous. Certainly Draco had broken form and had apparently gone for the high romance. And Hermes and Sirius... Okay, Harry had to concede that the two of them had been following pretty closely to form. Though to hear Remus talk, Sirius had played the field when younger. More like a Slytherin than a Gryffindor. But then again, he'd come from a long line of Slytherins and probably hadn't known any better. And Sirius had confessed to him that he'd been interested in Remus even then, and had only looked elsewhere because Remus seemed so indifferent. Harry groaned in irritation. Why on earth did such thoughts have to plague him now? Didn't he have enough to worry about without thinking about the state of his love life? He rather doubted that Severus had such thoughts plaguing him, nor would he appreciate the angst-filled ramblings of a bewildered teenager. He silently cursed Cornelius and Fudge for his stupid plans that had forced the situation on him in the first place. Severus was seated in front of the fire reading a book when Harry finally entered the room. Judging by the way the man was flipping through the pages of the book, Harry suspected he was irritated about something. He could hardly be reading after all. He was flipping the pages too swiftly for that. He stared at him for a long moment. The man had removed his teaching robes and was dressed casually in dark trousers and a white shirt. He'd showered earlier after their sword lesson, and his black hair looked soft and clean, the locks curling slightly where they draped against his broad shoulders. He wasn't truly a handsome man, not like Sirius, but he was attractive, his features strong and proud, his eyes intense. Even his nose was beginning to grow on Harry. It lent his face a certain aristocracy that he rather liked. Such thoughts confirmed to Harry all the more clearly that there were likely lots of people who would be interested in Severus. It seemed foolish now for him to have assumed he was completely unattached. Something tightened in his stomach at the thought. Are you having sex? He blurted out and was immediately horrified by himself. His face turned bright red in shock. He couldn't believe it just asked him at something like that. Severus looked up incredulously, his dark eyes widening in disbelief. Not at the moment, he growled, his resonant voice filled with disdain. He lifted his book briefly. This is called reading. Your education is sorely lacking if you're confusing it with sex. Harry sputtered in mortification. No! He squeaked, his voice breaking. I was wondering is there someone... I didn't mean to... He broke off, completely unable to finish his thoughts, unable to find the right words to ask his question. If his skin grew any hotter, he suspected he'd pass out from a heat stroke. Severus's eyes narrowed as he listened to him flounder for words. Is this your rather uncouth way of asking me if I'm currently seeing anyone? Uncouth! Harry exclaimed. Very. Severus sneered. Such a muggle turn of phrase. The proper way to ask such a question is to inquire as to whether or not I'm having an affair. Some of Harry's humiliation was turning to anger. Proper way? There's a proper way of asking such a thing? A wave of outrage washed over him. Naturally, Severus informed him coolly, once again leaping rather aggressively through the pages of his book. Though in truth, broaching the subject at all is a bit risky. After all, that might prompt me to begin asking questions of my own. Harry wasn't at all certain he liked the direction this conversation had turned. He felt both angry and unsettled, not to mention intensely confused. What questions? For example, I might be inclined to ask why Miss Brown had her hand on your thigh during dinner this evening. Severus stated, a cold snarl in his voice. She did not! Harry protested in shock. Severus snapped his book violently closed as he looked up swiftly and pinned Harry with a dark glare. She most certainly did. Harry found himself replaying the evening in his mind. Certainly Lavender had been sitting rather close to him, and she draped her arm over his shoulder several times, maybe touched him more than he liked. But he was fairly certain he would have noticed if someone had put their hand on his thigh. At least he thought he would, wouldn't he? She didn't, he denied again. I think I would have noticed if someone put their hand on my thigh. Even if she did, it's not like she meant... He broke off, sputtering again, unable to find the proper word. Not like she meant what? Severus demanded as he rose to his feet, tossing the book down on the coffee table. If you didn't notice someone putting their hand on your thigh, I'm finding it doubtful that you were capable of understanding what it might or might not mean. I know what it means, Harry shouted in outrage. I'm not stupid. I know if someone were flirting with me. Severus took a menacing step toward him, but Harry was too angry to care. Flirting. Flirting is the exchange of verbal innuendos. Sliding a hand up your thigh is more accurately described as throwing a pass at you. She wasn't throwing a pass at me, Harry insisted, glaring at him. I think I'd notice if someone was throwing a pass at me. Really? Severus mocked. And did you also notice when Miss Patil started playing with your hair? What? Harry stared at him in dismay. He did vaguely remember someone tugging on his hair, but he dismissed it as an irritant. She wasn't... they weren't throwing passes at me. I noticed if they were. She was seconds away from kissing you. Severus snarled at him, glaring down at him from his superior height. Harry could feel the heat from his breath fanning his already hot skin. His heart was pounding in his chest, blood coursing through his veins with a riot of emotions he could not name. Now I know you're delusional, Harry exclaimed, reacting with anger since he did not know how else to respond. I think I noticed if someone was going to kiss me. The strong arm that snaked around his waist caught him completely off guard, as did the hand that tangled in his hair. His exclamation of shock was muffled beneath the hot press of lips against his own as Severus captured his mouth in a demanding kiss that sent his thoughts tumbling away from him in chaos. His body was pulled hard against Severus's, the heat of the man's lean form burning his own as he was molded chest to hip to thigh against him, and the extraordinary sensation of a tongue pressing into his mouth, lips moving against his, warm heat devouring him. He moaned beneath the onslaught. Against his bidding, he raised his hands, clutching at the narrow, powerful hips of the man kissing him, feeling firm muscles moving against him, sliding beneath his palms. He couldn't think, could only react, unable to focus on anything other than the brilliant sensation of taste and touch. The demanding heat of Severus's mouth was intoxicating. And just as suddenly he was released, mouth bruised and tingling, body thrumming with energy as he stared up into the smoldering eyes of Severus Snape. Did you notice that? The man all but snarled at him before turning and striding angrily across the room to disappear through the door to his office. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Harry alone and breathless in the sitting room, body shaking with reaction. Frozen to his spot, mind so blank he couldn't have been able to react if Death Eaters had leapt into the room and attacked him. Harry raised his hand to his lips. They were still tingling with sensation, Severus' scent and taste still overwhelming him. Words from earlier this evening began drifting through his numb mind, Cold disdain? Cold regard? Polite affection? Which was this, he wondered. Because he wasn't certain he could handle anything more. His heart was still racing. Oh, Merlin, the man had kissed him. What on earth had he done to promise that? And could he do it again? A little voice asked before he squashed it into silence. He walked somewhat dazedly toward the bedroom, still tracing his kiss-swollen lips with his fingers. He was beginning to see what all the fuss was about, why his classmates were so obsessed with such things. That had been... Well, he wasn't entirely certain how to describe it. Wasn't entirely certain how to deal with the fact that he was talking about Severus Snape. Certainly, if someone had suggested such a thing 6 months ago, he would have reacted much differently. Harry stopped suddenly, his thoughts coming to an abrupt, scourging halt. Severus had never answered his question. In fact, like a true Slytherin, Severus had very pointedly avoided his question. Uncouth, he fumed. Uncouth to wonder if his bondmate was having an affair. Bloody Morgana, Harry cursed, before he strode angrily into the bedroom and slammed the door violently shut behind him. He wasn't going to apologize. Severus kept that thought foremost in his mind as he sat down at his desk and pulled out his quill to begin marking papers from class. No, he most definitely was not going to apologize. So what if he kissed the boy? The boy obviously needed kissing if he was too clueless to know what to do. Different girls were throwing passes at him in public. All day, he'd been trying very hard to rein in his emotions, which were still on edge after his conversation with Albus yesterday. After all, it wasn't Harry's fault that the rest of the world had taken an interest in him. The total strangers were questioning their marriage. And it wasn't the students' fault either, though he also wasn't going to give back the 50 points he'd taken from the various houses during the day. He liked that part. For the most part, he'd been in a semi-cordial mood when he'd finally gone down to dinner that evening. Harry had met him for their sword lesson earlier, and he'd been able to work off a great deal of his frustration in a relatively healthy manner. He nodded politely to Albus and Minerva, had greeted Hagrid with a casual inquiry about his health, and had served himself a modest portion of the roast beef waiting before his plate. The house elves had placed out a nice selection of drinks to go with the meal, including some pleasant wines, which were only allowed at the head table on rare occasions. Dinner had been going well. Fine, in fact. The Hufflepuffs were still giggling at him. The Ravenclaws were arguing about some meaning-of-life question that they were fairly certain that the rest of the world had gotten wrong. The Slytherins were whispering amongst themselves, no doubt plotting to take over the world. And the Gryffindors were loud and obnoxious. Like usual, everything was status quo. And then Lavender Brown had put her arm around Harry's shoulder and pressed her rather ample breasts against his sword. Severus had felt something twisting inside him at the sight. What was this, he'd wondered? It was obvious the Gryffindors were engaged in some sort of heated discussion, though he couldn't hear the details from the head table. But why this discussion required Lavender Brown and Parvati Patel to sit so close to Harry, he didn't know. But he saw Lavender smile and slip her hand underneath the table. He'd gone cold inside. Was she stroking his thigh? He tried very carefully to school his features into absolute stillness, intent on giving nothing away with his expression. It did not stop the sense of fury welling up inside of him. On the other side of Harry, Parvati was leaning closer to him, less well endowed, but prettier in face. She was smiling warmly at Harry, speaking softly to him. From here, it almost looked like she was whispering in his ear. When she'd raised her hand to touch Harry's hair, Severus's fist had tightened around his dagger hilt. What on earth was going on at the Gryffindor table? And where were the females climbing all over his bondmate? Guessing that he wouldn't likely be allowed to murder anyone in the Great Hall, at least not in front of Dumbledore, Severus had stormed out of the hall a while later, too angry to watch the Gryffindors any longer. Were some of those marriage proposals Albus had received coming from the other students at Hogwarts? He tried to remember the marriage customs of India. The Patils were Indian. Were they allowed to have more than one spouse there? Brown, of course, was English, but the little tart probably didn't care about customs or honor. He tried to calm himself before Harry had returned, but had spent the ensuing minutes wondering if Harry was going to return at all. Such thoughts had not been conducive to calmness. And then a few moments later, Harry had entered the room and asked him if he was having sex. Bloody Morgana! So he kissed him. Probably not the best response, but Severus was getting tired of being so bloody honorable, so bloody noble. He had a gorgeous, nubile, powerful, clueless young man sleeping in his bed night after night, and he had not laid a hand on. And really, Harry had been practically asking for it. And they were married for Merlin's sake. It was not like any court in the world would convict him for kissing the boy. No, he was definitely not going to apologize. And really, the boy looked far too lovely when he got angry like that, eyes flashing, face flushed with emotion. Asking him to keep his hands to himself was ridiculous. Was he a Slytherin or a Hufflepuff for Merlin's sake? And then he remembered the 3 fourth-year Hufflepuffs that were apparently putting his house to shame and decided that perhaps that was no longer a good comparison. He can apologize to me, he told himself as he marked a T for troll at the top of the paper he was grading. Imagine asking him such a question. He'd been with Harry every night since they'd gotten married and had been doing his best to keep him safe. When on earth would he have found time to have an affair? And why would Harry care in the first place? But if he did care, Severus still did that thought. Could he care? He tried to picture Harry's expression when he asked that question. Had he been jealous? Or had it been nothing more than idle curiosity? Fidelity was important to Harry. He knew that much from past conversations. Was he truly beginning to speculate about Severus's private life? And if he was, how could he turn this to his advantage? Magic take it, he muttered under his breath. What was happening to him lately? Why was he so obsessed with a boy he'd barely touched? Certainly no other person had ever gotten so far under his skin. He didn't know how to handle it. He sat lost in thought for a long while, no longer paying any attention to the papers he was supposed to be marking. Far too much of his time lately had been taken up with contemplating Harry. 6 months ago, when he'd married Harry, he'd done it solely to protect him, because Albus had said that the boy needed him. He'd promised himself then that he'd be an honorable partner. He'd been raised to believe that a man should treat his bondmate a certain way. With respect, with care, regardless of his personal feelings. And he'd set out to do just that. But somewhere along the way, his emotions had gotten involved. He'd once thought that when the time came and Harry turned his affections toward someone more suitable, he'd quietly accept the situation and turn a blind eye to any indiscretion, provided, of course, it remained properly out of view of the public. But he was beginning to realize that he was not likely to do that. Not likely to ever turn a blind eye to anything Harry might wish to do. And yet, at the same time, he had no desire to hurt the boy either. The whole thing left him foolishly hoping that Harry would simply turn his affections toward him. That would certainly solve all his problems, wouldn't it? Even as he thought the idea, the Slytherin in him railed at it. Hope was for Gryffindors, not Slytherins. Slytherins knew better. The last thing he wanted to do was behave like a foolish Gryffindor. Right? Sighing, Severus set aside his quill and cleaned up the papers on his desk. It was growing late, and sitting in his office brooding was not going to help him. He headed to the bedroom instead. Perhaps tomorrow things would look different. If nothing else, he was bound to learn what fallout his kiss had earned him. Harry was asleep when he entered the room, curled up neatly on his side of the bed, an empty vial of dreamless sleep draught on the nightstand beside him. He felt some relief at that. For what it was worth, his behavior had not caused the boy to suddenly mistrust him and forgo his potion, in favor of remaining alert to any advances Severus might make. He still cringed in guilt when he thought about the night he'd nearly taken advantage of the boy while he was asleep. Despite having showered earlier, he showered again, intent on taking care of his body's needs before climbing into bed beside Harry. Beneath the cascade of hot water, he stroked himself, for once letting his mind imagine what he might do if given the opportunity, how he might touch and taste Harry if offered the chance. Kissing Harry while he was awake had been far more enjoyable than when he'd been asleep. Asleep, he'd been soft and yielding. But this time he'd responded with fire, with strength. He'd struggled briefly before melting into him, opening his mouth to his tongue and responding with eager, angry passion that made the magic beneath his skin vibrate through his body. He stroked himself harder, eyes closed, as he pictured Harry in his mind, saw his kiss-swollen lips and glazed green eyes. He closed his other hand around the heartstone still hanging around his neck, feeling the overwhelming sense of Harry's magic pulsing through his veins. He cursed softly to himself after the fact. So foolish. So desperate. Angrily, he washed away all signs of his indiscretion before leaving the shower and dressing in his nightclothes, the heartstone hidden beneath his nightshirt once again. A quick wave of his wand extinguished all but one candle as he climbed into bed. Unable to help himself, he looked down at Harry, letting his fingers trace lightly over his features. The boy turned softly toward his touch, but did not wake. The soft lips parted in his sleep, and Severus felt his groin tightening in response. "Foolish Gryffindor," he whispered. "You should know better than to tease a snake." But then again, that was what Gryffindors did best.